All right, so for those of you who are just joining this series, we're looking at the life of Jesus. We're looking at him as a historical figure. And specifically what I want to focus in on is why was he called the King of the Jews? So when they crucified him, they put a sign above his head saying, "This is the King of the Jews." Why was that? What was that about? When we think about Jesus, we think of him in titles as Savior of the world or Forgiver of sins. That's not how they saw him. And certainly that's not how the Romans saw him. They saw him as, claiming to be, or people claiming him to be the King of the Jews. And so that's what I want to look at. What does that mean? What was the significance of that? And so in order to do that, we've been looking at the story of the Jews, the story of Israel. And so to really understand Jesus's life, we have to understand the story that goes up to it, because what Jesus really presents is the culmination of the story of Israel, at least up until that point. Now, the thing we have to remember is that Jesus is still an Old Testament character. Now, that's a bit confusing because we read about Jesus in the New Testament. And so our New Testaments begin with Matthew, which looks obviously at the life of Jesus. And so we just assume Jesus is a New Testament character, but he wasn't. The New Testament doesn't officially begin until Acts chapter 2. So at Pentecost, with the outpouring of the Spirit, that's when the new covenant formally begins. Prior to that, we're still in the old covenant. And so what Jesus actually represents is the last 3 years of, or at least his ministry represents the last 3 years of the Old Testament. He's kind of the culmination of that. He's the end point of where the law had been moving the people towards. At least, certainly that's how the Christians perceived his ministry to be. Of course, not everyone believes that Jesus was the Messiah. He wasn't, for many Jewish people, he was just a nobody. He certainly wasn't who the Christians claim him to be. Nevertheless, Jesus is an Old Testament character, and so to understand his story, if he's finishing the story of the Old Testament, then we have to understand what that story was. And in particular, we need to focus in on the years that were happening between the Old and the New Testament. If you're just reading your Bible start to finish, you'll get to the end of Malachi, and what you've seen is that the Jewish people have been in exile in Babylon, and then they've been released, or they've been sent back by this new empire, by the Persian Empire, and they're just starting to reestablish themselves now as a new people, or as in the new world order that they find themselves in. And so this is where we left off with our story last week. And what this actually begins is a period, at least within our traditional Bibles, a period of about 400 years, where at least if we're reading our Bibles, we don't have any information. We just simply don't know what happened, if that's all the sources that we had. But fortunately, we have other sources like Josephus, for example, or we've got sort of the books like 1 and 2 Maccabees, which you'll find maybe in some Catholic Bibles that have sort of those documents that cover that intertestamental period, or the apocryphal texts that we don't, certainly as, Protestants, include within our normal Bibles. But what they talk about is an incredibly important period of history, which really completely reshapes the whole world of the Mediterranean, and certainly the world that Jesus was born into. Just, I guess, by way of indication of where we're going today. Have you ever stopped to notice? I guess if you're looking at the Bible in the original languages, you read your Old Testament and you'll find that it's written obviously in Hebrew, and then later on there's some texts that are written in Aramaic. But then when we come to the New Testament, it's written in Greek. Suddenly, seemingly overnight, the entire language has completely changed. But then in addition to that, there's all of these new features of this world that Jesus is walking in, and then later on the apostles, that are just completely unfamiliar to us from our Old Testaments. For example, the temple is still there, but you go from being a Persian empire, or at least under that Persian Empire, to now all of a sudden we've got a Roman Empire. And not only do we have a Roman Empire, which presumably all speak Latin, we're still speaking Greek. We've got our texts that have been written in Greek. But we find in Jesus still hints of Aramaic. We find Aramaic terms coming through into the Greek New Testament that have been translated into Greek, because not all of them spoke Aramaic. Certainly those out in the Greek world that were reading these documents, that's completely changed. Suddenly we've got synagogues everywhere. We've got these things called synagogues that have popped up all over the world, wherever there seems to be Jewish communities. And the fact that there's all of these Jews spread all over the Roman world. When you finish up the Old Testament, and for the majority of the Old Testament, they've always been in Israel. And now all of a sudden there's Jews absolutely everywhere in these synagogues. Now, in addition to that, what you've also got are Pharisees and Sadducees. Who are these people? Where did they come from? All of a sudden, there's these very important, very seemingly politically powerful people, Pharisees and Sadducees, that seem to be throughout the Gospels and particularly antagonistic towards Jesus. Who are these people, number one? And why do they seem to hate Jesus so much? Or at the very and in reverse, why did Jesus seem to be so opposed to the things that they were doing? Who are these people? Where did they come from? So there's so many things that we find in our New Testaments, and when we look at the life of Jesus, that are so different from our Old Testaments. And unless we look at that history, unless we cover that ground between our Old and New Testaments, then these things will just simply make no sense. We've got no idea what's going on within our Gospels. So where we want to sort of look at today, we finished off last week with the Jewish people having been taken into exile under the Babylonians. So that takes place in 586. The Babylonians finally destroy Jerusalem. Now remember that Israel, the northern kingdom, had already been taken years ago into the Assyrian Empire, and they'd been scattered. The 10 tribes of the north had been completely dispersed throughout that empire. Down in the south, however, the 2 tribes of Judah and Benjamin had remained through that Assyrian empire. They had basically followed the rules of keep the peace and pay the taxes. I mean, the rules of empire are really simple. Keep the peace, pay the taxes, and you'll be okay. They'd done that. But then when the Babylonians came through, they just failed in that 2 simple rules. And so as a result, they were taken off into exile. And this was such a devastating moment for the Jewish people, because to be the Jewish people, to be Israel, you are a nation. Now, to be a nation, you need land. And to be the nation of Yahweh, to actually have him as your God and your king, you need a temple. You can't worship a God without a temple. It doesn't work. There's no concept in the ancient world. If there's no temple, and certainly if there's no statue of a God, then there is no God. What was unique about the Jewish faith was that they didn't have a statue of the God. And as we see later on, this actually sort of led to accusations of them being atheists. If we can't see the God, then he doesn't exist, as far as the surrounding pagan world would imagine. But losing your temple is devastating. There is no temple. There's no way to worship God correctly. How do we sacrifice to Yahweh if we don't have access to the altar? How do we achieve forgiveness of our sins? How do we achieve atonement for what we've done if there's no temple? We're in exile. We're in Babylon. We can't do that. The only temples around here are the temples of the Babylonian gods, which are absolutely pagan gods. And to worship at one of those is to break law number 1, which is you shall have no gods before me, which is what got us in trouble in the first place. So that's not going to happen. So we can't even get back to Jerusalem to worship properly. What are we to do? And so this is an absolute existential crisis that the Jewish people find themselves in. But where we left off the story was a glimmer of hope. What had happened was that the Persian Empire the Persian Empire sort of emerges out of what is modern day sort of southern Iran, which is why the Iranian people still speak Persian. That was the original language of that region. And so in 539, Cyrus, the king of the Persian Empire, he takes what was the Babylonian Empire, also what was the Lydian kingdom, also the Median kingdom. There were several sort of smaller kingdoms or empires throughout the Middle East region. He consolidates all of them into what has now become the largest empire of history to that point. And really, this is the whole game of empires. The whole story of human history is a story of empires, and this is no different, only it's a question of who's got the biggest empire. So now, by what we've got at this point, is that the largest empire to date is the Persian Empire. And it really is an incredibly massive empire. It covers if you just Google the Persian Empire, and you can see the expanse of it. It covers the entirety of the Middle East. It goes right down into sort of the northern parts of Pakistan, right down into India, and even up into Europe, up into Macedonia. It covers that entire region. So the largest empire that the world had ever seen. And the Jewish people, or what was Israel and Jerusalem, are just a very small part of this massive empire. They're just a postage stamp on the edges of this empire. So if you want to put that into modern terms, because we sort of got to keep a bit of geography in mind, the furthest extent of this Persian Empire goes to what is modern-day Turkey. So it really goes to the edges of the Mediterranean, up into Macedonia, which is sort of up into the northern parts of Greece. So it crosses over what is now Istanbul, up into Europe, up into Macedonia. So an absolutely enormous empire. Now, what was characteristic about this Persian Empire? It was absolutely massive. What really sort of characterizes their approach to an empire? Again, remember, the two rules of empire are always very simple: keep the peace, pay the taxes. But the way in which the Persians were able to maintain the stability of the people, you got to always think, there are benefits to empire. There is security that it provides. There is the larger infrastructure that it provides by being so wealthy. But of course, people don't want to be, and traditionally autonomous city-states and nations don't want to be controlled by another foreign entity. Right? Nobody wants that. No one has ever wanted that. And so there's always going to be that potential for resistance. So again, keep the peace and we'll be okay. And they say that because there's always going to be that potential for rebellion, to be pushing back against this empire and saying, we don't want you here. We in the same way that the Babylonians are pushed back against the Assyrians, that's always going to be a potential threat. And so something that the Persians do, one of the ways to help mitigate this, is that they very enthusiastically embrace a lot of the cultures that they have now conquered. And the Persians are they just love anything new. They love anything that is a sort of a new exciting adventure or a new indulgence. They're all over it. And so they embrace the cultures. They certainly don't impose onto their subjects their own Persian culture. They don't impose their language. This is why Aramaic remains the language of Jesus in the New Testament. Aramaic goes back to the Assyrian Empire. He's not speaking Persian. That was one of the more recent empires, but they don't change the language. They keep the existing languages. And so they really sort of adopt and really conform themselves to the cultures of the people that they're ruling. But what really sets this empire apart, what makes it so successful and so large, is that it's highly organized. Now, writing had already been developed, and the idea of bookkeeping and these sorts of things. Well, what the Persians really do is take that to the next level. They're extremely organized, and what they set up is a very, very efficient bureaucracy. They're going to allow people from whatever local region that they've conquered to remain in place, and to sort of bring them into this Persian bureaucratic system, which enables them to maintain the stability of the empire, to maintain the financial stability of this great empire, which creates stability. And by creating stability, you're less likely to have rebellions. If the people's lives are made easier, if their lives are more efficient, if their lives are actually prospering under this well-organized empire, then in a way, they're doing a lot better than they used to be. And so there's less chance of them pushing back or rebelling because, well, things are better. Things are actually a lot better now. And so this is good. Maybe that in some ways it's an improvement in their lives. And so the Persians, in a sense, sort of bring that as well. And so with this new organization, with this new prosperity that they find, they build new cities throughout the empire. So the kings of Persia build these great new cities, big, prosperous, beautiful cities that, again, are just a demonstration of the lavishness and just the extravagance of this empire. Now, of course, these kings, King Cyrus and all the kings, Xerxes and Darius and all these kings that come after, they're always going to understand themselves to be gods, right? That is just part of being a king in the eastern part of the world, in the Middle East. You're always going to be understood as being a god, and that's how you maintain your power. So that's nothing new, right? The pharaohs had always been doing that. So to be a king and a god is a standard practice that you get in this region, and that again enables you to maintain your your power. Now, what that also requires is that you are undefeated, right? If you're defeated in battle, how can a god ever be defeated? And so that's going to raise questions about your deity. And so you've got to be careful to make sure that you keep up the facade of success and power, because if that drops, people might see just a human, and then they might start to think, well, maybe this isn't what it's all cracked up to be. And so that's a very important part of maintaining these empires, which these kings seem to successfully do. Along with that, they've got a massive, well-organized military and a very aggressive, expansive military, which helps to continually increase, but also protect the boundaries of the empire. So that creates security within the empire itself, which again enables that prosperity to take place. If you're not having to fight wars every spring, if you're not having to constantly defend your crops and your women against invading people from the village up the road, you can prosper. You can focus in on building wealth. And so within the empire itself, it's going to become more prosperous because of the security provided by this military force, and that military that's been provided for by the taxes and the tributes that are paid to the empire. So all of that's going really well. And in 538, so the year after 539, Cyrus defeats Babylon, which is kind of the last vestiges of the previous empires. He now has complete control of the entire Middle East, down to the borders of India, sort of right up into the edges of Macedonia. The next year, 538, is when he says to the Jewish people in Babylon, hey, go home. If you want to go home, you're welcome to. Go back to Jerusalem and reestablish that. For all the reasons we said last week, it's very politically advantageous to have the people back in their own land. They're going to be happier back there. They're going to create a prospering place in what is currently a desert, or what is currently a ghost town. Well, this is good for them as well. And so he sends them back. And not only does he say go back, he actually says, here are the materials that you need to rebuild your temple. And so this is a great moment. For the Jewish people, this is an incredible moment. And in fact, as we saw last week, King Cyrus himself was spoken of by the Jewish people. We see references to him in the Old Testament as a Messiah figure. He was seen as an incredibly benevolent, generous overlord. And really, they had nothing but praise for the guy because he allowed them, one, to go back, but also gave them the resources to rebuild this temple. And so many do go back. They estimate maybe about 42,000. This is certainly the count that we get from our Old Testaments, return back to Jerusalem. Now, what this begins, and which is the title of this week's topic, is what we call the Second Temple era. Because the first temple, if you remember, the first temple that was built by Solomon, that had been effectively run down and ultimately destroyed. There was really nothing redeemable from that. It had been subject to devastation when the Babylonians had come through, and then just the decay that comes with being neglected for the decades that they'd been in exile. And so for those guys, for that temple, that was it. That needed to be rebuilt and restored. And so they rebuild this new temple by a guy by the name of Zerubbabel, leads that process and builds what now becomes this second temple. So for these people that have returned, this is a fresh start. They still have burned into their memories, into their psyches, what has just happened. They have just been taken away from their land. God has come good on his promise to them that if they are disobedient to the covenant, it will end badly for them. And that's exactly what has happened. This is God keeping his word. And so they've taken the lesson on this. They've realized, when they first went into exile, the thought was, has God abandoned us? And they've come to realize very quickly, no, he hasn't, but he's punishing us for our continued disobedience. So that's a lesson learned the hard way. We were disobedient. We broke rule number 1. We ended up in exile. Our priority now is that will never happen again. We will never go back into exile. That is our absolute priority. And the way that is going to happen is that we will absolutely fulfill God's law to the nth degree. We were negligent before. We neglected God. We took him for granted. That will never happen again. And so this is almost like a pledge that the Jewish people that are returning take, that this is a fresh start. God in his mercy has allowed us to come back, and we will make sure that never happens again. And so they rebuild the temple. Zerubbabel directs this project. They rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, so you can read about this in Nehemiah and Ezra. And so this seems to be a great thing. For many of the Jewish people, this is this is a great day when the temple is inaugurated. But for many of the Jewish people, they wept. The temple has been built, it's functioning again, everything seems to be back to normal. But for many of them, they wept because they remembered the old temple. They remembered the way that things used to be. And what they remembered is that when Solomon's temple was consecrated, God's glory fell on it. They couldn't stand in the temple for the glory and the cloud that had come down to consecrate this temple. This new temple gets built, and it's just another day. There's no glory. It's just crickets. There's nothing like what happened with Solomon. And so in a way, we're back, we've got our temple, but it's not the way that it used to be. Something has changed. It's sort of take two of the Israel story, but it's going to be a different story, and that becomes very clear. So the temple isn't quite the same, but perhaps the biggest difference between how things were before the exile to how things are afterwards. Remember, before the exile, they still had their land and they were paying tribute, but the land was still theirs. They had a king. They were led by essentially their own person. The king himself was kind of a puppet king, but it was still a Jewish king, and there was still a relative level of autonomy. Under the Persians, it's a different story. It's similar, but it's just got a little bit worse in that now they're fully part of the Persian Empire, and really what they are is living on Persian land. This is now part of the Persian Empire. They have been really relocated to another part of Persia. This isn't the land that God had given to them, set apart with borders, that this is the nation of Israel. This is just, well, Jerusalem and some of the surrounding territories, you can live there, but it's entirely Persian land that you're living on. Effectively, it's like you've been taken away from your house, and then the person who took you away says, you can go back there, but it's not your house and you're just going to be paying rent to live there. So what they have instead of a king is a foreign overlord. King Cyrus is now their king, and every subsequent Persian king is now the king of, well, the whole empire, but including Jerusalem and the Jewish people. And so to be a nation, to be God's autonomous nation, to be a people set apart for God's glory, you have to have all of those markers. You have to have the land, you have to have your own borders, you have to have the temple, you have to have your own king, you have to be your own self-governed people. You are now governed by Persia. So you've kind of got something of a return to how things were, but it's really actually not even close. It's almost, in a way, it's almost like the exile never stopped. We were in exile in Babylon. That became the Persian Empire. We're still in the Persian Empire. So really, how has the exile actually changed? Only that we've relocated our particular geography within this continuing exile. So things are better, but they're not how they should be. Clearly, that's the point. God has taken us on the first step back to restoration, but the job's clearly not finished yet, and the job won't be finished until there is a temple that is ours. We've sort of got that, but land that is ours with our own borders that we control with a Jewish king. That's how it was always meant to be. That's what God had always promised to us. And so until we have that, then we're not fully back to the way things were. We're still essentially and technically, we're still in exile. So then who is at least ostensibly ruling the Jewish people? Well, that's the king, of course, but if you remember, the king doesn't personally rule over all of these different regions. What the king will do is put in place a governor. They'll put in place somebody who's working for them. So that might be a local king or a local leader from that particular people group. They might appoint their own Persian leader to a particular region. Whatever the needs are of that region, that's what they're going to do. And that person is always working for the Persian king. Their job, like the job of empire, keep the peace, collect the taxes, that becomes their job. And so the Jewish people don't have a king anymore, but what they have instead is a high priest. So this priest now takes the role of leadership. The priest isn't the king. The priest never will be the king. The priest is the priest, and it's his job to facilitate the cult. But it's also his job now, in a sense, to lead the people, but as a representative of Cyrus, of this Persian king. Now, the particular priest that they set in place, or the descendancy that they're able to find for this priest, is from the house of Zadok. Now, if you remember from your Old Testaments, Zadok was a descendant of Aaron. So at the very least, this still has that Levitical descendancy. Remember, the priest always had to be from from the tribe of Levi. So Zadok does descend from Aaron, who was a Levite. So he has that sort of Levitical lineage, but Zadok was the priest that endorsed Solomon when there was a contestation for the throne. So David dies, there's a sort of a dispute over who's going to take the throne. Zadok was the one who endorsed Solomon. So he has that connection to the line of Judah. He has that Davidic connection. This is about as close as we're going to get to how things were. We've at least got a priest that is Levitical, but what we don't have is a king. And the king is always going to have to be from the line of Judah, and specifically from the line of David. Now, there's only the two tribes that are left, Judah and Benjamin, but the king was always meant to be from the line of David. That was the promise. So to David and to all of his descendants, we'll always have a king on the throne. So the king that we're looking for has to be from that line of David. And really, this is the promise now that they're holding out for. They're holding out for a return of a king from the line of David, a sprout from Jesse, from the tribe of a descendant from Jesse, who was the father of David. So until those things are in place, until we have our land back, until we have a king from the line of David, and we have full autonomy, we are our own people led by our own king, and God is our God. We're not paying taxes to some foreign overlord. Until all of those things are in place, this exile is still going. It's improved, but we're still in exile. And so what all of that describes is actually only one small segment of the Jewish people. There's only a remnant that return. They're the ones that go back and reestablish Jerusalem, reestablish the temple. But for many, many more of the Jewish people that had been in exile, that's where they stay. They actually don't return. And if you read your Old Testament, you maybe get this sense of they're faithless people, or that they're, whatever, maybe some negative connotations around them. Not like you've got this chance to go back to the promised land. Like you can go back home to what is your home. Why wouldn't you take that opportunity? What's wrong with you? But it's actually quite understandable when you consider how long they'd actually been in exile they've been in exile for decades and decades. Probably a couple of generations had come and gone. So all of the people that had gone into exile certainly would have been dead. Their children, some of them would have grown up to become adults and then had children, and some of them probably would have died. And so the children then have grown up. They would have been the generation that would have had the opportunity to go back to Jerusalem. Well, that's a nice idea, go back to the traditional land of our people, but that's not our land. We've been brought up in Babylon. We know Babylon. We speak Aramaic. That is now our language. We don't know Hebrew. And frankly, if we have to make a choice between living in Babylon, which is the most beautiful, incredible city of its time, or living in a ghost town and rebuilding a ghost town from scratch, it's not really an option. It really is a case of, a second or third generation immigrant who may be living in Australia, who's grown up in Australia, and someone saying, you can go back to the land of your ancestry, to the land of your ethnicity, and saying, well, I don't speak the language, I don't understand the culture, I don't know anything about what that is. This is my home, this is my language, this is what I've been brought up in. For me, this is home. For me, this is where I belong. And so for many of the Jews who stayed, this is where they belonged. For them, this was home. And also, what is presented to them now in this new Persian Empire are opportunities to branch out. They've been released from their captivity. Well, we don't necessarily want to go to Jerusalem. Maybe you want to go to some of these other cities around the empire, some of these other large cities up in what used to be the Lydian kingdom or the Median kingdom, wherever you might find yourself. We want to move out and establish ourselves in these new parts of the world and have new opportunities in thriving cities that are already in existence. And so what this creates is then a new, type of Judaism, or a new type of Jewish person, which is what we call the diaspora, literally the dispersed ones. These are the ones who spread out now through this Persian Empire, who don't return to Jerusalem and establish themselves in pockets of communities all over the Persian Empire. And what we're going to see as the story continues, where we find Jewish communities as far away as Rome. You know, if you think about, by the time we get to Jesus and Paul's time, Paul travels all around the Mediterranean, and he goes from as much as we can see of his story, gets as far as Rome, where he's finding these thriving Jewish communities. Wherever he seems to go, he can find himself a Jewish community. Why is that? Well, because the majority of these Jews spread out and established themselves in these cities all around the Mediterranean. Now, what does that mean then for being Jewish? Again, remember, just to recap our story, to be Jewish, to be the people of God, you live in the land, you worship at the temple, that's where you encounter Yahweh. That's what makes you Jewish. You speak Hebrew, you read Torah, you circumcise your children. These are the markers of what it means to be Jewish. And so remember, Judaism, or what comes to be Judaism, what was established in Torah, isn't just a set of laws to keep God happy. It was an entire way of life. It was the constitution of a nation. To be the people of God is to consume every bit of your life, every aspect of your life. Therefore, there's going to be ways in which you do that, and it's only by doing those things that you can truly claim to be the people of God. Again, this is what got them in trouble in the first place. It's failure to be the full people of God. They neglected those traditions and so ended up in exile. Now, for those that are returning, they can go back to the land and certainly worship at the temple. Well, that really enables them, and to be in Jerusalem, to be with Jewish people, to be as close to the original plan as possible, it makes it very easy to maintain that Jewish identity. It's easy to be Jewish in Jerusalem, in the heartland of the Jewish race. Well, that's very easy to do that. And so for those people, they're going to have a much easier time of maintaining their identity. There's going to be challenges that will come, and we'll see that next week. But for the most part, it's easier to remain Jewish when everything around you facilitates your Jewish identity. It's an entirely different story when you're living away from Jerusalem. So for these Jewish people who are spread out in this diaspora, who are in all of these foreign cities, how do you maintain that Jewish identity? Well, you don't have the land anymore, and so you can't say you're not the local people. You're not the people of God in the sense that I'm living in the land that God gave us. I'm actually in a foreign land. I'm a foreigner. Literally, I'm a foreigner in these lands, and especially in cities and in lands that don't know anything about Yahweh. They don't know anything about the God that I worship, and they don't care about the God that I worship because they've got hundreds and thousands of their own gods. And so these Jewish diaspora, these scattered Jewish people are going into these cities that have been established for centuries, who have been worshipping their own gods for all of that time and will continue to do so. Coming into that culture, they can't just say, well, we're here now, so we're going to make this the land of Yahweh. That's never going to happen. So they're foreigners in these places, and it's not their land. So that's number one. But secondly, they don't have a temple anymore. So they can't have that encounter with Yahweh. They certainly can't come and offer a proper sacrifice regularly for atonement of sins, because they don't have the temple there. And the only temple for Yahweh is only ever going to be in Jerusalem because that's where he planted himself. That's where his temple is. And there will be no other temples. There are no alternative temples to the one in Jerusalem. There's only one, that's in Jerusalem. And so if we ever want to encounter that temple, we have to travel to Jerusalem. Now, that's not going to be easy, especially when you're coming from a place like Rome. So for those guys, they don't have the temple. They can make a pilgrimage maybe once a year, and they often would do that. But for the rest of the year, you don't have the temple. And so you don't have the land, you don't have the temple. So these two key identity markers are no longer available to you. So what's left? You are not going to be integrated and assimilated into the local culture. That's not something that's going to happen because, again, that's what got us in trouble in the first place. We assimilated to all of these surrounding cultures. God took us into exile. We're never going to do that again. We need to maintain our unique Jewish identity, which primarily stems from Abraham. We are ethnically Jewish people, so we have to maintain that. The only way we're going to do that is to stay within our own people, right? We're not going to be going and intermarrying with all of these people because that's what happened to all the tribes in Israel. They disappeared. They no longer exist. We've got to avoid that as well. We need to at least stick together, number one. And so what happens in these cities then is we get these little pockets of Jewish communities emerging in all these major cities, which is, again, when you think Paul traveling around the Mediterranean, seems to always encounter Jewish communities. He always seems to find a group of Jewish people that he can relate with and that he can sort of interact with. Again, that's because when they came into these cities, they stuck together. They kept themselves together within their unique groups. But they weren't the only markers of being Jewish, that being the temple and the land. There were other key indicators or key things that a Jewish person had to do in order to remain Jewish, to be part of the people of God. First and foremost amongst these was circumcision. You always circumcise your boys, and that's what marks you out as the people of God. So circumcision is absolutely fundamental to what it means to be Jewish. And it's an easy identity marker because nobody else is doing it. No one else does circumcision. The only people that do circumcision are the Jewish people, to the extent that for many of the Greek people that they eventually encounter, they loathe the very idea of circumcision. They think it's the most vile thing that anyone can ever do to themselves, that sort of desecration. And so it's, in fact, one of the things that they really despise about the Jewish people is the fact that they're circumcised. And so it's very, very easy for you to know who the Jews are because they're the ones that are circumcised. So that's a key identity marker. And you might ask yourself, how on earth are they going to know who's circumcised and who's not? Well, think about public baths where, well, you get the idea. So circumcision, absolutely essential. Another key marker is Sabbath. So Sabbath, every Sabbath is Saturday, not Sunday. So Sabbath, you don't work. And so you know who the Jewish community are because you never see them on Saturday. Now, the thing about the ancient world is there's no such thing as a weekend. You work 7 days a week. So to have a Sabbath is a big deal because you're losing a work day. So they were mocked roundly for observing this Sabbath because they should be working, right? That's what are you going to be doing? How are you making money if you're not working? So keeping Sabbath is absolutely essential. So you just don't see the Jews at all on Saturday. And so that's another key indicator, and that's the thing that the Jewish people become very faithful about keeping. This is why when you see later on in the Gospels, you've got all of these Pharisees saying, we've got all these rules about Sabbath. You can't do this and you can't do that because we don't want to break any of these rules. We've got, this rule of keeping the Sabbath. Well, what does it mean to keep the Sabbath? What does it mean to break the Sabbath? So we can create 100 other rules about what it means. Well, these are the things we have to live by in order to keep the Sabbath. So that's another key identity marker. Thirdly, kosher. We don't eat meat really at all. Certainly we don't eat pork. That is just absolutely, we will never, ever, ever eat pork. We've never done that. We never will. But we don't eat also any meat that's sacrificed to an idol. The only meat that we'll ever eat is proper kosher meat that might be sacrificed to Yahweh. That's it. That's the only option that we have. So another key way that you can pick the Jews is because for the most part, they're vegetarians. Now, why is that? Why aren't they eating meat at all? Well, in the ancient world, meat isn't very prevalent. You've got plenty of pigs. Pig is the most available meat because pigs can have a lot of litters. They're having litters all the time. So there's always plenty of pigs being bred. There's always plenty of meat available from pigs. But for, red meats like, sheep or goats or cows or this sorts of things, very, very hard to come by. And anytime you have that meat, it's always going to be in the context of a sacrifice. So there are sacrifices happening all the time. And this is where people do get a day off. They're working 7 days a week, but there's lots of festivals through the year, like public holidays, where they're going to have some time off. At those festivals, at those sacrifices, there's going to be lots of meat. So all of the animals are brought in, they're all sacrificed. And the best part of it goes to the god and then to the priesthood. But then afterwards, you've got all of this meat that's only going to go bad. So all of a sudden now, all the local butchers in town are flooded with cheap meat. So all of a sudden now, meat is available. Everybody can eat meat because, well, it's there. It's cheap and it's available. So for everybody else, that's great. We've got meat that we can go and buy, but a Jew would not eat that meat in a pink fit. There's absolutely no way a Jew is going to eat that meat because it's meat that's sacrificed to an idol. That is just not something that's going to happen. And so therefore, for the Jewish people, apart from maybe eating fish, they're really not going to have anything that resembles any sort of meat at all. Now, as time goes on, you get some larger Jewish communities that, because they're so large, they actually can justify or it gives reason for the local butchers to start to do kosher meat because that's a market there. There's enough Jewish people that might buy this kosher meat. Well, maybe it's worth me doing that. But that's only going to be in larger cities like Rome. For the most part, meat is just not an option. And so for the most part, for the Jewish people, they're going to be vegetarian and at the most, maybe eat fish. So kosher is another thing. And again, it's another point of amusement to the Greeks and to the later on to the people that they live amongst that they don't eat pork. It's like it almost becomes a running joke, to the Jewish people. Why don't you guys eat pork? It just seems very strange. So these are some key identity markers that you can maintain. But above all of these, and really informing all of these, is Torah. It's the law. This is what we do have. One of the unique identity marker of the Jewish faith is the fact that they have scripture. No other gods have this. Gods have priests that they speak to and that they sort of encounter or have engagement with, but the reality is for the gods will change their minds on a whim. No one ever really knows what the gods want. Whereas this God, Yahweh, made it very clear. He set out 10 clear rules about what it means to be the people of God, and then overall ways to be the people of God. Now, the challenge, however, for this new generation of diaspora Jews is that a lot of the rules that God has set in place only pertain to living in the land, living in Israel, and particularly having access to the temple. We don't have that anymore. And so what we need to do is to interpret the law or to figure out how to apply the law in our new context. We are absolutely faithful to it and will continue to be so, but there are certain things that we just simply can't do anymore. Like, for example, tithing. That's just not something we're going to do anymore, or certainly stoning people to death if they're wearing the wrong fabrics or whatever the laws might require. And so there was a need to rethink, to reapply the law within the new context. But the point of maintaining faithfulness to that law is absolutely essential. And so for all Jewish children, from the day they're born, they're raised with the law. They're taught to memorize the law. Every child is educated in the Jewish world in as far as they're taught the law. They're taught Torah. They're taught to memorize it. Even if they can't read, they memorize it. They learn it by heart. So the law, absolutely essential. And how to apply that, absolutely essential. So all of these things are the new way in which it is to be the people of God. It's not the way that it was prior to the exile. It's a new world order, but these are the things that we can double down on, and that's what's going to make us unique. But the key thing through all of this, it's one thing to be a Jewish person and to live a certain way. You can be as an individual Jewish person, these are the things that you need to do to maintain that your place within the people of God. Remembering too, in the Jewish understanding, there's no idea of salvation. We think about, in Christianity, we think about the idea of being saved. And so, take me, for example, I was raised in a family that wasn't Christian. We never went to church. And so I was saved at the age of 19 apart from my family. And so it was an individual thing that I did. I encountered God, and so became a Christian. I devoted my life to him, and, the rest is history. We have that concept of salvation, of God redeeming us from a life of sin. You don't have that idea in the Jewish world. In the Jewish world, you're born as the people of God by virtue of being the child of Abraham. You are born into a covenant by virtue of just being created into this earth. You are already the people of God. There's no need for salvation. And so, my children will one day, by God's grace, commit their lives to Christ. I don't believe that because they're born into Christian parents, they're automatically Christian, because they're not. That's something they have to decide for themselves. But there's no concept of that in the Jewish world. You're born as the people of God. You're born into that covenant. It's your responsibility from that day forward to maintain your place in the covenant. So it's not about getting in, it's about staying in. It's about remaining and keeping your place, keeping faithful to that covenant that you've been automatically signed into. Now, in order for that to happen, first of all, you need faithful parents, Jewish parents, who are going to show you and raise you in the ways of the Lord. You need parents who are going to keep faithful themselves to the requirements of the covenant to then show you how to do that. And that's the primary responsibility of the father. This is the great responsibility that every Jewish father has, is to raise their children to be obedient to the law and to be obedient to the covenant. But more broadly than that, it's one thing to have a Jewish family in a city of 10,000 people who are all worshipping hundreds and thousands of pagan gods. That's not going to be easy for that family to maintain their faithfulness, because they still need to interact with their cities. They still need to at least go and buy food. They need to work. They need to engage with that city. And if you're the only Jewish family in a world that is surrounded by all of these other gods and temples and cults and these sorts of things, it's not going to be easy. You are going to be isolated. It's going to be very difficult for you to maintain that relationship when it's just you and your tiny little island. So what you need is community. In fact, that was always the purpose of the law. It was to create a community, a people who were God's people, not individuals, but a people, a group that you walk into that group, and this is the nation. This is what it means to be the people of God, not just because of the way that we engage immediately with Yahweh, but the way that we engage with each other. The law wasn't just about keeping God happy, but it was about maintaining a civilization. It was about maintaining a culture that was entirely devoted and living out the values of God's kingdom. And so therefore for these diaspora Jews, that's what you need. You need to remain in your community. And so again, these pockets of Jewish communities sort of coalesce within these cities, and the larger cities maybe have larger communities of Jewish people. But the question is, well, where do we go? Where do we go to meet as a community? We can go and meet in someone's house, but they can't host the whole community, right? Not everyone can fit in one person's house. And so how do we go? And particularly on the Sabbath, what do we do? Like, how do we go and worship Yahweh? How do we learn Torah? How do we come to know what God wants from us? How do we study that? Where do we go to school? How do we socialize as a people? Where's that going to happen? So what is needed is a meeting place. What is needed is a town hall, a place where the community can come together and be the community together. And so then what emerges as a result of this are literally meeting places. The Greek word for a meeting place is synagogue. Synagogu, literally just means to meet. It's just a meeting hall. Like, we're going down to the meeting hall. Or is the name for it? No, it's just the meeting hall, the synagogue. And so what the synagogue does then is that it functions as the town hall. It functions as the meeting hall for the Jewish community. It functions as their church, for want of a better term. It's not a church, and certainly in the way that we understand it, but it's the place where you go on Sabbath in order to hear Torah, to learn about Yahweh, to go and meet together and to be the community. It's a place where during the week kids will go to school. It's a place where meetings will happen, where weddings might happen. It's also a place where the Jewish community can do their own courts. The way that these empires work is that we're very happy for you to administer your own laws, so long as you keep the peace and don't break the bigger laws of what's required in this empire, which aren't many. Sort yourselves out. Deal with your own problems in-house. And we can talk about that at another point. So the synagogue can also function then as a courthouse. It can be a place where if you as a Jew violate the requirements of the Jewish community, we're going to punish you. And at worst, we're going to excommunicate you from the community. In fact, we see this later on with Paul when he talks about being given the 40 lashes minus one on 5 different occasions. That was a Jewish punishment. That was a synagogue punishment for blasphemy. That was the highest form of punishment you can receive. And in fact, in those occasions, Paul had two choices. One, to be excommunicated from the community, or 2, be flogged 40 times minus 1. Now, why 40 times minus 1? Well, because in Deuteronomy, it says that you can flog a person, but never more than 40 times. And so what the Jews will say is, well, we'll only flog you 39 times so that we don't break the law in punishing the lawbreaker. So that was what Paul experienced. He was flogged on 5 different occasions, which is a fascinating thing when you consider that he had the option to be excommunicated. Instead, he chose to be flogged because it meant that he could still come back to that community and keep preaching Jesus. But that's a whole nother story. So the synagogue functions as the sort of one-size-fits-all, one-stop shop for anything related to the Jewish community. Think about just a local town hall. On Sundays, they can function as a church. On Saturday night, they can function as a wedding. Through the week, they can have town hall meetings or local groups coming to meet. Like, it's just a space for people to come and meet and to reinforce themselves as a community, to reinforce their status as a community. This is exactly what synagogues do. And so naturally, synagogues are going to pop up all over the world. And so again, by the time we get to the New Testament, we go from a world where we've never even heard of a synagogue to it's like wherever we turn, we seem to be seeing synagogues absolutely everywhere. So this is something of the situation now. The Jewish world order has completely changed. It's gone from being the people of God living solely in Israel, autonomously, living under their own king, worshiping in Jerusalem. That world is gone. This is a brand new way of doing the Jewish world, of doing the Jewish life. And it is what we call the Second Temple era. It's a completely different way of doing things. And it's different for 2 groups of Jewish people. On the one hand, those Jews that went back to Jerusalem and were reestablishing something of the nation again. But for many, many, many more of these people, it was scattered throughout and establishing pockets of Jewish communities all over the known world. But in both cases, for the Jewish people, there was a recognition that this is not the end of the story. This isn't what God promised us. He'd said to Abraham, we will have our own land, a temple, we will be our own people, we will be governed, autonomous, all of those things that were promised to us. That's not happening. We're sort of there in some ways, but we're not fully there. And until that happens, then this story is still being written. We're not finished yet. And so this is what we're looking out for. What we are right now is maybe on the way there, but it's still also in a holding pattern. What we're waiting for is the return of a king. We're waiting for the root of Jesse to spring up again and to provide for us a king who isn't just going to be our king, but he's going to bring the nation back together, that is going to call back the lost tribes, that is going to reestablish the people of God in the land as God had always determined for that to happen. That's what we're waiting for. And until that happens, well, we're not finished yet. We're just in this somewhere through the middle chapters of the story. What we have to do in the meantime is to make sure that we don't blow it again. We blew it before, we're never going to do that again. So wherever we find ourselves, we are going to strictly maintain our unique identity as God's people so that we don't blow any chances we have of being fully restored. So that becomes our prerogative, maintaining our identity in any way that we possibly can and hold out for this promise that God has given us, that the root of Jesse will provide a new king. There's something will spring out and he's going to make things new again. Well, that's what we're waiting for. That's what we're looking out for. And obviously you can see ahead in the story to this is where Jesus fits into the story. But for now, between now and when we meet Jesus, we've got this holding pattern where we've just got to keep true to the faith, to the identity. That's going to be difficult. And particularly for those who are outside in the diaspora, because they're actually foreigners outside of their own land. And what will constantly be coming against them is not just political or religious pressure, but social pressure to conform, to fit in, or to the very least be able to interact and engage with the communities and the cities in which they find themselves. So that's the new challenge that's going to be happening now for these people, for the Jewish people. And well, this is where our story will continue next week. Well, anyway, thank you so much for joining me this week. Have a fantastic week, and I look forward to seeing you next week. All the best.